Picture this, a once thriving nation. Its currency worth less than the paper it's printed on. Citizens carrying wheelbarrows full of money just to buy a loaf of bread. ATMs running empty. Banks closing their doors. This isn't some dystopian movie. This has happened to real countries in our lifetime, and it could happen again. What if I told you that the same mistakes that bankrupted entire nations are being repeated, right? Now, as we speak, stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand the fatal errors that brought powerful economies to their knees, and more importantly, how to protect yourself from the same financial devastation. Welcome back to Financial Freedom Desk, where we break down complex economic events into insights you can actually use. I'm bringing you the real story behind national bankruptcies, the kind of analysis mainstream media won't give you. If you're serious about understanding how money really works and protecting your financial future, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because we're diving deep into economic truths that could save your wealth. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's talk about something most people think is impossible. How does an entire country go bankrupt? When we hear the word bankruptcy, we think of individuals or businesses, but nations, countries with armies, natural resources, millions of citizens. How can they possibly run out of money? Yet history shows us that national bankruptcy isn't just possible, it's happened dozens of times. And here's what should terrify you. The pattern repeats itself with eerie consistency. Let me be crystal clear about what we're discussing today. We're not talking about poor nations that never had wealth to begin with. We're talking about countries that had everything. Booming economies, educated populations, valuable exports, and still managed to destroy themselves financially. Let's start with Argentina, because this story is absolutely mind-blowing. In 1913, yes, over a century ago, Argentina was one of the richest countries on earth. We're talking top 10 globally. They had wealth that rivaled the United States. The capital, Buenos Aires, was called the Paris of South America. The country was swimming in agricultural exports, beef, wheat, and prosperity. Fast forward to today, and Argentina has defaulted on its debt 9 times. 9 times. The most recent major default was in 2001, but they've been playing financial Russian roulette ever since. Their currency has been devalued so many times that Argentinians have learned not to trust their own money. They hoard US dollars, they buy property, they do anything except keep their savings in Argentine pesos. So what was Argentina's fatal mistake? Here's where it gets interesting, because it wasn't just one mistake, it was a toxic combination that created a perfect storm. Argentina discovered the dangerous drug called the printing press. When governments face tough choices, cut spending, raise taxes, or print money, printing money is the easiest political option. It requires no painful decisions, no angry voters in the short term, but it's economic poison. Argentina printed money to pay for everything: government salaries, social programs, subsidies, debt payments. At first it seems to work. Everyone has money. But here's the brutal truth. Creating money doesn't create value. You can't print your way to prosperity. All you're doing is diluting the value of every peso in existence. The result? Hyperinflation. In some years, Argentina's inflation rate exceeded 3,000%. Imagine going to sleep with $1,000 in the bank and waking up with the purchasing power of $3. That's not a nightmare scenario. That's what happened to millions of Argentinians. Argentina spent money it didn't have on promises it couldn't keep. Generous pensions, subsidized utilities, government jobs for everyone who wanted one. It sounds compassionate, even noble, but economics doesn't care about intentions, it only cares about math. When your spending consistently exceeds your income, you have 2 options: cut spending or borrow. Argentina chose to borrow, and borrow some more. They borrowed from international banks, from the IMF, from bond markets. The debt piled up like a mountain, and eventually the mountain collapsed on them. Mistake number 3, political instability and policy whiplash. Every new government in Argentina tried a different economic strategy. One administration would implement free market reforms, the next would nationalize industries, then back to privatization, then back to government control. This constant flip-flopping destroyed investor confidence. Think about it from a business perspective. Would you invest millions in a country where the rules change every few years, where the government might nationalize your company tomorrow, where contracts might be torn up based on political wins? Of course not. And neither did international investors. Capital fled Argentina like rats, leaving a sinking ship. Now let's talk about Greece, because this bankruptcy happened in our modern era. In the European Union, no less. Greece joined the Eurozone in 2001, which meant they adopted the euro as their currency. Suddenly, they could borrow money at the same low interest rates as economic powerhouses like Germany. And boy, did they borrow. The Greek government went on a spending spree that would make a lottery winner blush. They hired government workers by the hundreds of thousands. They offered early retirement at age 50 for certain professions. They built infrastructure projects that made no economic sense. They hosted the 2004 Olympics and spent over 11 billion euros, nearly triple the original budget. Greece made the fundamental error of thinking that borrowed money is the same as earned money. When you borrow, you're not richer, you're just spending tomorrow's money today. And eventually, tomorrow arrives. The Greek government borrowed to maintain a lifestyle their economy couldn't support. They borrowed to avoid making hard choices. They borrowed to win elections by promising generous benefits. They borrowed because the money was cheap and the consequences felt far away. But consequences always arrive. Greece's borrowing costs skyrocketed as investors lost confidence. Eventually, Greece couldn't borrow anymore. They faced a simple choice: default on their debt or accept a brutal bailout. With strict conditions, they chose the bailout, but the price was devastating. Pensions were cut by 40% or more, unemployment reached 28%, and youth unemployment exceeded 60%. The Greek economy shrank by 25%. Think about that. 1/4 of the entire economy simply vanished. Families who had planned comfortable retirements found themselves destitute. Young people with university degrees couldn't find work. Businesses collapsed. Suicides increased. This wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a human catastrophe. Let me tell you about a bankruptcy that's happening right now as we speak. Lebanon defaulted on its debt in 2020. And the situation has only gotten worse. This is a real-time economic collapse unfolding before our eyes. Lebanon's story is particularly instructive because it shows how a banking crisis can destroy an entire nation. Lebanese banks offered extraordinarily high interest rates on deposits. We're talking 15, 20, even 30% annually. Where did you ever hear of banks offering those kinds of returns? That should have been the first red flag. These banks used new deposits to pay interest on old deposits. Does that sound familiar? It should. It's the classic structure of a Ponzi scheme. Lebanon stopped focusing on building real economic value. They didn't develop industries, manufacture products, or create services the world wanted to buy. Instead, they built an economy based on financial engineering, shuffling money around, creating the illusion of wealth without the substance. The Lebanese lira was pegged to the US dollar, which created a false sense of stability. The government and banks promised this peg was unbreakable. They promised deposits were safe. They promised interest payments would continue forever. Every promise was a lie. When the money stopped flowing in, the system imploded. Banks froze, accounts, people couldn't access their own savings. The lira lost over 90% of its value. 90%. Imagine your entire life savings losing 90% of its value overnight. Lebanese citizens who had diligently saved money for decades found themselves impoverished. The middle class was essentially wiped out. People couldn't afford food, medicine, electricity. Lebanon, once called the Switzerland of the Middle East, became an economic disaster zone. If you want to see how quickly wealth can be destroyed, look at Venezuela. This country sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves. Larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia, Venezuela should be rich beyond measure. Instead, Venezuela has experienced one of the worst economic collapses in modern history. Hyperinflation reached levels that are difficult to comprehend, millions of percent per year. The currency became so worthless that people stopped counting it and started weighing it. Restaurants updated their prices multiple times per day because inflation moved that fast. Venezuela fell victim to what economists call the resource curse. When a country has abundant natural resources, particularly oil, there's a temptation to stop developing other parts of the economy. Why invest in agriculture, manufacturing, or technology when you can just pump oil out of the ground? The Venezuelan government took this to an extreme. They nationalized the oil industry, then used oil revenues to fund massive social programs. When oil prices were high, money flooded in. The government spent lavishly, making promises they could keep only as long as oil stayed expensive. But commodity prices don't stay high forever. When oil prices crashed, Venezuela's revenue collapsed, but the spending commitments remained. The government's solution? Print money. Massive quantities of money. The result was predictable: hyperinflation that destroyed the currency and the economy. Venezuela also made another critical error. They drove out expertise. They fired thousands of experienced oil workers and replaced them with political loyalists who didn't know how to run an oil industry. Production collapsed. Even with the world's largest reserves, Venezuela couldn't produce enough oil to save itself. Now that we've looked at these specific cases, let's identify the pattern. Because there is a pattern, and it's terrifyingly consistent. Every bankrupt nation refused to face reality until it was too late. They ignored warning signs. They dismissed critics as fearmongers. They convinced themselves that this time is different, or that they could somehow escape economic gravity. Argentina kept printing money and insisting inflation would magically stop. Greece kept borrowing and pretending the debt didn't matter. Lebanon kept running a Ponzi scheme and claiming it was sustainable banking. Venezuela kept ignoring economic diversification and assuming oil prices would stay high forever. Reality always wins. Always. Politicians in these countries made decisions based on election cycles, not economic fundamentals. They chose policies that felt good today, even though those policies guaranteed disaster tomorrow. It's politically easier to spend money than to save it. It's easier to promise benefits than to explain why those benefits are unaffordable. It's easier to blame external forces than to take responsibility for policy failures. This short-term thinking is perhaps the most dangerous mistake because it's so seductive. Every generation of politicians can pass the problem to the next generation. Until one day, there's no next generation to pass it to, the music stops and everyone realizes there aren't enough chairs. In every case we've examined, corruption played a major role. Government officials enriched themselves while their countries burned, contracts went to friends and family instead of qualified companies, public funds were stolen or misallocated, oversight disappeared. Corruption isn't just about ethics, it's economically devastating. When people don't trust their government or institutions, they act accordingly. They hide money, they refuse to invest, they prepare to leave the country. Capital flight accelerates, making the crisis worse. None of these countries focused on the fundamentals. Are we producing goods and services that the world wants to buy? Are we educating our workforce? Are we investing in infrastructure and technology? Are we creating an environment where businesses can thrive? Instead, they relied on shortcuts. Argentina relied on its agricultural heritage without innovating. Greece relied on borrowed money and tourism. Lebanon relied on financial engineering. Venezuela relied on oil. Real wealth comes from production, innovation, and trade. Everything else is just moving money around or creating the illusion of prosperity. So how do you know when a country is heading toward bankruptcy? The warning signs are remarkably consistent. Trouble is brewing. Greece's debt reached 180% of GDP. Lebanon's exceeded the 150%. These aren't sustainable levels. When prices keep rising year after year, it's a sign the currency is being debased. What starts as moderate inflation can accelerate into hyperinflation when wealthy people and businesses start moving their money out of a country. They know something. You don't pay attention to where the smart money is going. Frequent changes in government, protests, or authoritarian crackdowns suggest deep economic and social problems. When a country can't maintain its foreign currency reserves, it's running out of options. When investors demand higher interest rates to lend money to a country, they're pricing in higher risk of default. You might be thinking, this is interesting, history, but what does it mean for me? Everything. Absolutely everything. First, understand that national bankruptcy doesn't just happen over there to other countries. It can happen to any nation that makes these fatal mistakes. The United States has a debt-to-GDP ratio over 120%. Many developed nations are on similar trajectories. The warning signs are everywhere if you know how to read them. But second, you need to protect yourself. Don't keep all your wealth in one currency or one country. Diversify. Hold some assets in different currencies. Consider precious metals. Invest in skills and knowledge that retain value regardless of economic conditions. Third, stay informed. Don't rely on government assurances or mainstream media narratives. Look at the numbers, watch what the smart money is doing, pay attention to the warning signs we discussed. Fourth, prepare for instability. We live in an era of massive debt, currency debasement, and economic uncertainty. The nations that went bankrupt all made the same fatal mistakes. They lived in denial, prioritized short-term political gain over long-term sustainability, allowed corruption to flourish, and ignored the fundamentals of productive economic activity. They printed money instead of creating value. They borrowed instead of earning. They made promises they couldn't keep. These aren't just history lessons, they're warnings. The same mistakes are being made today in countries around the world. The debt levels are higher, the money printing is more aggressive, the warning signs are flashing red. But here's the good news. You're now aware. You understand the pattern, you can see the warning signs, and most importantly, you can take action to protect yourself and your family. Knowledge is power, but only if you use it. Don't wait until banks are closing and ATMs are empty. Don't wait until your currency loses 90% of its value. Act now while you still have options. If this video opened your eyes to economic realities you hadn't considered, do me a favor, share it. Send it to your friends, your family, anyone who cares about financial security. These are conversations we need to be having, and drop a comment below. Which country's story shocked you the most? Are you seeing any of these warning signs in your own country? What steps are you taking to protect yourself? I read every comment, and I want to hear your perspective. This is Financial Freedom Desk, where we cut through the noise and give you the economic truth. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're going to keep bringing you the analysis that mainstream media won't touch. Remember, nations that ignore history are doomed to repeat it. Don't let your country or your wealth become the next cautionary tale. Until next time, stay informed, stay prepared, and stay free.